Hi, everyone. This is Marav Fine calling in from the Jewish Funders Network in New York, and we are here today going to discuss civil rights in the Jewish community. We're joined by April Baskin, the Vice President for Audacious Hospitality, David Bernstein, the President and CEO of the JCPA, and Jennifer Langton, the Grants Manager for the Amy Mandel and Cantina Rodas Fund. And before I get into telling you a little bit about them, just a moment about the Jewish Funders Network. Our mission here is to work with individual funders and foundations, folks at every level of philanthropy, to improve the quality of their giving and to leverage the power and creativity of their network. And so we're here all about getting together and giving together and understanding the community better together. We base all of our programming in JFN values. They're listed on our website, and I can send them around, but I think this one falls under respectfulness very clearly, derech eretz, listening carefully and respectfully to one another, learning how to talk to one another and to hear one another. And so let's start with our first speaker, Jennifer Langton of the Amy Mandel and Katina Rodas Fund. Please take it away.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. I'm really excited to share with you all and have a good conversation. So I think the question today is centering around, why do civil rights matter and why do we support racial justice work in our social justice funding? And I think it's really because we're committed to social justice, diversity, and community. And we primarily support work that advances LGBTQ rights, but also that work which increases racial justice and combats anti-Semitism as well. And so we have this realization that full rights and lived equality must really include those who exist at the marginalized intersections of gender, class, race, and sexuality. So if you're looking at poverty, criminalization, access to health care, education, you really have to look at these intersections. And I guess we have a slide just pulled up here. And this is just a message from Amy Mandel, who manages this fund. And she just asked for all of us to think about, especially in this moment, to break out of our silos that we tend to keep in when we're doing a lot of social justice work, and to really, work in allyship and partnership across intersections. And she upholds two examples of organizations that use Jewish values, a Jewish lens, for looking at social justice, in particular racial justice. So Bend the Arc and Jews for Racial and Economic Justice are just two examples, two organizations that are really doing this work well. And also just the idea that basically, we don't always have to support Jewish-led organizations doing this work, that we can actually uphold those groups and organizations that are really working on this and just be an ally again and demonstrate that we're all in this with everyone else. And so really our funding strategy can be pretty broad. We do work in allyship, and we draw from our shared history of Jewish people working together from the civil rights movement in this country with African Americans and also the Latinx community. And so we do support people of color-led organizations and organizations that really are wanting to help communities of color. And then also that work that really addresses, again, those intersections, looking at race, ethnicity, class, gender, and sexuality. And we're also involved in 3 collaborative initiatives that we feel really underscores our values of tikkun olam and also, loving your neighbor as yourself, really upholding and anchoring ourselves in those values. And finally, just looking at the data and facts, like who is our community? Who is our broader community? And in that community, who really needs the support, who's being left behind, who's being marginalized. And so it's hard to ignore data and facts. And so this also drives our funding too. And I mentioned our collaborative initiatives, so I'll just touch on, we have 3 that we're involved in right now. And the first 2 are based in New York City. One is with Funders for LGBTQ Issues, which is a national organization. I was part of the Out in the South initiative. It took 3 years to come to being, and we had our first line of grants last year. And what happens is that we have this pooled fund where national and local funders from the South put our money together, and we're trying to build up the philanthropic infrastructure in the South that's really emphasizing LGBTQ people. And so we gave out, I think it was $500,000 last year. And we're also really looking at those LGBT funds that are emerging, that are focused on people of color, and maybe led by people of color too. And so these are matching and planning grants that these funds can use, and then they can actually make grants to their local organizations. And we realize as funders that we need to kind of use our funding as a carrot to help push people forward, help push the philanthropic structure forward and organizations forward, and really building in more racial inclusivity and also racial justice work into their way of working. And so that's on our minds as well as we roll out 2017 with grants. And the other collaborative initiative is with the LGBTQ Racial Justice Fund, and that's set up just for the South, again, national and Southern funders. It's based out of New York City with the Estrella Lesbian Fund for Justice. And it's really great. The money only goes to those organizations led by people of color, and also that are LGBTQ as well. But they really address broader issues of poverty, access to health care, criminalization, immigration, all sorts of things. And then finally, in our own backyard is our Co-Think Giving Circle. And that was created, and it is led by African American and Latinx people, pooling money together to give back to the community, to those groups that are only led by people of color, again, African American and Latinx. And that's really exciting. Allies can be a part of it, so we consider ourselves white allies, and it's an opportunity for us to learn how to be allies and sometimes how to take a step back and listen, and just to really learn how to do that well. And it's also involved with leadership, so upholding those leaders, giving out awards to both allies and also African American and Latinx leaders in our community who are doing great work, and recognizing them. And then also we're launching a leadership series later this year as well. So that's all very exciting work, and that's just a little snapshot of what we're up to. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer, for giving us that overview of the sort of the spectrum of work that you guys are doing. Our next speaker, David Bernstein, is going to take us into some more detail, talk about Jewish engagement in civil rights and the work that he does at the JCPA.
Great, thank you. And you put up the PowerPoint on the screen?
Yep.
There it is. Okay, I'm not sure how I advance it, but...
I'll advance it for you. You just let me know.
Okay, great. All right. So, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for including me in this discussion. My point of departure in this is asking the question, how do we get the civil rights movement back into the mainstream of the Jewish community? How do we engage mainstream Jews who may feel some historical kinship to the civil rights movement and may still think in some way, shape, or form that we're in it, as Amy Mandel said in her statement, but really don't understand that we haven't been in it and that we're not at the tables we need to be at. And while there's some very good people from the organizations that were mentioned that are involved in this, that the rank and file of the Jewish community, even those that are most engaged in advocacy work, haven't really been at the table. So we're asking ourselves, how do we change that dynamic and motivate the Jewish community to be engaged at a new level so that we're part of the discussion, we're leaders in the movement, and we're making a difference in society. So let's go to the first slide. So a point of departure, and not necessarily a point of departure for all those who have been involved in this work for many years, but a point of departure for maybe many in the mainstream Jewish community. I remember seeing this image from Palestine to Ferguson on my TV set at the height of the Ferguson rallies and that were taking place. And I thought to myself at the time, what a brazen and cynical exploitation of somebody else's social justice cause. And it never occurred to me that this would actually gain traction and that many people would see this as many in the Black Lives Matter movement would see this as a legitimate use of the language and see the Palestinian cause as a direct link to their own work. That was going back to 2014. Fast forward to August 2016, and I'm sure you'll remember that the Movement for Black Lives, which is a distinct subset of the Black Lives Matter movement, issued its platform, I think a 45-page platform. And in the platform, in one paragraph, there were several mentions of Israel, Palestine, one of which called Israel a genocidal state, and it set off alarm bells within the Jewish community, caused a major public controversy. It probably actually propelled the platform from the Movement for Black Lives into the spotlight in ways that it might not have gotten otherwise, because we created such a controversy around it, and led to a lot of internal discussions and hand-wringing about where we are and why this happened and how could this have happened. And I don't think we understood that we were not part of that conversation, and that maybe it was time to take a close look at that. So go to the next slide, please. Rob, next slide. Oh, there you go. Thank you. Okay. So these are a few tweets that were sent from Palestinian solidarity groups in the middle of the rally in Ferguson. Don't keep much distance from the police. If you're close to them, they can't tear gas. So Ferguson from Palestine. If you look at how many likes or how many retweets, 541,541 retweets. Always make sure you run against the wind to keep calm when you're tear gassed. The pain will pass. Don't rub your eyes. Again, 672,000 retweets. So while we were watching this on TV and wondering what it meant from Palestine to Ferguson, there was a lived reality for many who were involved in the movement coming from the Palestinian territories, from activists who had been engaged with the Israeli forces and who were sending a strong message and were insinuating themselves into the conversation. So while there were a few Jews, and some very prominent Jews, who were involved in all this, too few Jews were involved in it. And as you can see here, there were many activists, Palestinian activists, those who were sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, who were directly involved with it, some on a social media level, some actually out there marching on the front line. So, next slide. So, we're asking ourselves, okay, let's take a step back here and think about it a little bit. One time we saw ourselves, and maybe we still do see ourselves, as intimately involved in the civil rights movement. It's part of our collective imagination that we Jews were standing side by side, that through Abraham Joshua Heschel, and we were on the front lines of those. And we all have friends and family members who actually were there and did stand and did put themselves in harm's way. But too few are doing so now. So we're starting to ask, so why do this? Why re-engage? And I want to make these three rationales. One is that we care about the larger society. We care about what happens to our brothers and sisters in other ethnic and faith communities and in other minority groups that are facing difficult conditions. We care. That's number one. It comes out of our sense of self as people who are dedicated to tikkun olam and social justice. The second reason that we cite is that we don't want to be alienated from other minority groups. We want to feel connected, a sense of connectedness among with others. And if we're not there in the trenches, we're not going to feel a sense of connection. And lastly, and perhaps most controversial, is that, yes, we do care about Israel. And while we don't need Israel to justify this work, there are many people in our community who say, listen, if we're not engaged in this, then why would anybody care about what we think? To quote a statement, I don't remember exactly who said this, but to have a friend, you have to be a friend. And I don't think we've adequately been a friend. And so, therefore, we don't have the friends that we would like to have. This can be controversial, this third point, because people say, well, you're not doing it out of the purest of motives whenever you list that third bullet point. And obviously, we're not out there to broadcast it. We're talking among ourselves here. But I've always felt that we're entitled to be complex people. We're entitled to have more than one motive. We're entitled to think both about the larger society and ourselves at the same time. And there's no reason why we should shrink from that. I don't need Israel to tell me that the treatment of Bernard Noble, a 49-year-old African-American male in Louisiana who's in jail for 13 years because of possession of 3 grams of marijuana. I don't need Israel to tell me that's an outrage. I can be engaged on that issue because it's an important issue and because it's something that we need to fix for society to reach its highest potential. Next slide. So, how can we re-engage? The first thing is we have to know the issue. And the issues in Civil Rights 2.0 are different than the issues of Civil Rights 1.0, the ones that we all are familiar with. In 2.0, we think a lot about criminal justice reform and huge disparities in the criminal justice system. We think about the 2 million people who are incarcerated in the United States, more than any other country in the world. We think of the 1 out of 15 black males who are in criminal justice system, which is way out of proportion to their size in society. We think about the numbers of people in the African-American community who are harassed by the police, which is also significantly out of proportion to their size. We think of draconian drug laws, many of which were instituted in the 1990s, which had drastic effects on society and created more disparities. We think about the school-to-prison pipeline, a phrase you'll hear, which is about how this sort of discipline system begins sometimes at school and conditions the system and the victims of the system for the kind of penalties and life that they're going to live once they leave school as well. And we think about reentry into society and how after you've been in the criminal justice system, how hard it is to get a job, how hard it is to become part of your community, because we continue to penalize people even when they leave the criminal justice system. So these are issues that are hot on the agenda. Obviously, the dynamic is changing because of the new administration, and we don't know quite where the new administration is going to be. But you should also know that this is not all happening at the federal level. This is also happening at the state and local levels, and there's still much we can do, even if the federal level is not auspicious for this kind of intervention. We need to get to know the Civil Rights 2.0 landscape. There are new organizations, very often not the ones that we've been working with for many years. We have to familiarize ourselves with some of these new actors and get to know groups that are new that may or may not be immediately receptive to working with us, but we're not going to know unless we try. We need to relax litmus tests. What I mean is that there are going to be people in our community who say you shouldn't meet with that group because they once issued an anti-Israel statement, or you shouldn't touch Black Lives Matter with a 10-foot pole. Well, if that's the case, we'll probably do more to isolate ourselves than isolate anybody else. we need to empower Jews of color. It's an incredible resource that have been under-leveraged in our community. We have people in our own midst who are part of the civil rights conversation and who have their own distinct experiences, and yet we haven't brought them in other ways as well, and that simply hinders our ability to do this work. We need to connect more young Jews in this. I can tell you, as someone who's visited campuses, there are a lot of young Jews who would be involved in this work, would love to be involved in this work. Many are as confused as their parents are as well, and are finding it hard to figure out how to connect to social justice causes. So we have to work with them in developing new ways to connect in high school, to connect in college, to connect after college as well. And lastly, we need to find our own voice. Sometimes, especially for mainstream Jews, not all are going to immediately buy into the entire set of beliefs and ideas surrounding the current civil rights issue. Sometimes we'll hear statements such as white supremacy, which most Jews will think of as the KKK or neo-Nazis, and yet has a very different meaning in today's current civil rights discourse. We may not be ready to embrace all these terms. We may not be ready to buy everything that others are saying in there. Yet we have our own rich social justice discourse that we can draw upon, and we can develop our own language. And I think it's important. Like, I don't use, for example, when I talk to mainstream Jews, I don't use the term racial justice, not because it's not an important term and it's not one that shouldn't be used, but because I feel immediately it might alienate them in the conversation. It may suggest something to them that they're not ready to necessarily embrace. And instead, we talk about racial equality, which is more civil rights 1.0, but may help ease people into this conversation. So we have to help people find their own voice, their Jewish voice, to engage in this conversation. So we have a lot of work to do, and it needs to be funded, frankly, not just the work that we're doing directly, but the work that this broader community is doing needs to be funded, and we need to be able to find ways of getting Jews into this new Civil Rights 2.0, because if we don't, we're not in it, and we need to be in it. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for your passionate, empowering presentation. Learning about, so we've now had the overview, specifically Jews and civil rights, and what we can do to affect change. And now we're going to get down into a little bit more specific with April Baskin, who is audaciously hospitable and is going to tell us all about that. Thank you so much, April.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Merav, and it's such a pleasure to be on the call with all of you, and in particular Jennifer and David. I'll echo Merav and say, David, I'm deeply moved and empowered by what you shared, and so thrilled across the three of our presentations, mine, which I'll get into in a moment, in terms of the alignment. Before I dive in, I think it's just worth noting the obvious and saying that we're in an unprecedented moment, and in a really powerful, special, fragile moment. And I'm excited to see the different collaboration that's happening, and I think that this moment calls on us to function differently, and to be strategic and to try on different partnerships and relationships that we have yet to, which is largely simply to underscore what Jennifer and David have already shared. So, as noted, my name is April Baskin. I am the Vice President of Audacious Hospitality at the Union for Reform Judaism. I have been in this position for a year and a half exactly, almost to the day, as of tomorrow. And here at the URJ, Audacious Hospitality is a part of our four-prong strategy for our 2020 vision, which I will dive into a little bit. Next slide, please. My goal for my segment of this presentation is to inform you, give you a little bit more information about Audacious Hospitality and some of the work that the URJ is doing explicitly around both racial and ethnic diversity and specifically racial justice. Talk a little bit and give some background about who Jews of color are. David set that up nicely for me to give you a little bit of background to help better explain the diversity within our community, and talk about some contemporary dynamics and reframes aligned with what was shared, as well as share some tools. So next slide, please. At the heart of Audacious Hospitality is the belief that we will be a stronger, more vibrant Jewish community when we not only welcome, but deeply incorporate the diversity that is the reality of modern Jewish life. Next slide, please. We're grounded in, without going into depth right now, Audacious Hospitality has 6 guiding midot, 6 guiding Jewish values that guide and inform our work. That starts with harkens with welcoming guests, which is what I think people generally tend to think of when you might hear Audacious Hospitality, but ultimately, Audacious Hospitality is a spiritual practice that is multifaceted in the values that it contains, and that ultimately what we're aiming for is not simply welcoming, that's excellent and critically important and core and always must be there, but that we're going for an end goal of kavod, of how do we see in Jewish communal life that all of us are consistently and regularly honored and acknowledged, and that by doing a better work of including the diversity, the rich diversity in our community. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, great. By including the rich diversity in our community, that our leadership and the way we approach our social justice work will begin to change. And we're beginning to see that right now, even as it's represented here at the URJ, with me as a vice president, being that I am a Jewish woman of color. That's a first within the URJ, and I hope to see more of that throughout our broader Jewish community, because I'm either the only one or one of a couple. And that's a really exciting opportunity for us for all of the reasons that David articulated. Next slide, please. Really briefly, the 3 premises or prompts of what sort of initiated the need for audacious hospitality is 3 overarching trends. That we tend to think we're a lot more warm and welcoming than we are in practice. I think that's a part of the human condition at times, or a number of spiritual communities, and certainly is true within the Reform Jewish movement here at the Union for Reform Judaism, is that we actually need to be more proactive about that and touch base with people. And that it's not so much about whether or not we think we're warm and welcoming, but do our guests and do people in our community feel that? Next is that Jewish diversity is no longer a wave. It's the ocean of Jewish life. We're dealing with a different reality. And third, as many of us know, in terms of institutional life, there are more Jews who are outside of our institutions than who are in. And so our call here at the URJ, which leads the largest and most diverse Jewish movement in North America, serving 900 congregations, 17 summer camps, and 2 million Jews and their partners of other faith backgrounds, is that for us is a call to say, not simply to judge or say, how are we not engaging people, but saying, what are we missing, and how can we be in better relationship to engage people in ways that are relevant for them. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So right now, today, the focus is predominantly around the new civil rights movement, racial justice, Jews of color, but it's good to put that in the context of these demographic changes we're seeing across the board. 71% of non-Orthodox marriages since 2000 have been interfaith. In many of our communities, and particularly within the Reform movement, we see that many of our members are either Jews by choice or Jew adjacent, are people who are not Jewish but have chosen to be part of our community, and we want to honor and engage them in effective ways. At least 20% of our community has a disability that's either physical, mental, or intellectual. And right now, Jews of color, which we'll dive into more deeply, can be measured at being anywhere between 10 and 20% of our Jewish community. That's 1 in 5. LGBTQ Jews make up 10% of our community right now. That statistic is growing as well. And we have a huge generational range of diversity and needs, and the needs of our millennial cohort are quite different than those of our boomers in some ways. And how are we speaking to those in this moment? And definitely a part of that I would contend, and studies demonstrate as well, is that millennials today, diversity is a part of the milieu of their lives, and our Jewish community and programs need to speak to that. And part of that, a key part of that, and in our strategy in Audacious Hospitality, is to engage people who are on the margins, as Jennifer noted, and essentially sort of push out. If we think of our community as a tent, at times that might be an overused metaphor, but I'll go with it right now, right? If we go back to our biblical reference of Abraham and Sarah's tent, we want to push out the tent poles so that everyone is included underneath that tent and we can engage. And what are some of those ways of doing that? Part of that is definitely better understanding our diversity. So in the honor of the theme of this program, if we can go to the next slide, I'll take a moment to give you a little bit more background on the Jews of color, which David Bernstein noted. So Jews of color, meaning, and that's a pan-ethnic term, which includes Jews of Asian, Latino, African descent, and that can also potentially at times, now the language that's developing, even just within the last year, we see that language is evolving in a number of fields, and this is one of them, is to say Jews of color, Sephardim, and Mizrahim, so JOCSM. And so when we talk about Jews of color, often that term is referring to Black, Latino, Asian American people and people who have mixed heritage among those. And according to the Steinhardt Center of Social Research at the Cohen Center at Brandeis University, their population project reports that 11% of American Jews are Jews of color. Other estimates out of think tanks such as Bechol Lashon demonstrate that another at least 10% of our community is of Mizrahi and Sephardi background. And Jews come to our community through a variety of ways, including being born into the Jewish community. We're a global Jewish people. Our people comes from all parts of the globe. So it's a misnomer that this is a new trend, but it is a rising trend nonetheless, particularly in the United States. And it's rising because of interracial relationships as well as transracial and transnational adoption and conversion as well. Next slide, please. This is my favorite slide of the presentation. Often Jews of color aren't seen in our community. And I think in some ways, Jews of color can be one of a couple tests or sources of communal self-reflection for us, or a litmus test in terms of how we're doing in our work around racial equality and inclusion work. If our community is 10 to 20% of it is Jews of color, and yet so few of us come across a Jew of color, that's because we're not there, we're not in the community, and that to me is a call to action for us to better engage in this work more broadly in the world, because that conveys a message to our partners and allies as well as to Jews of color, to our own people, that they matter in our community and that they're seen and that they're just as valuable as everyone else. And also, too, by doing that, we will be in better shape to more powerfully do the work that we need to do within our community. Next slide. A couple years ago, I won't dive into this research right now, but it's worth noting, I wrote a thesis about the experiences and identities of Jewish young adults of color in American Judaism. And I found a variety of fascinating results, but one of the most significant was that across the board, I found that most of the Jews of color, and I interviewed Jews of color from all across the United States, across denominations, across racial and ethnic backgrounds, and as well as socioeconomic status. It was a diverse cohort. And then I did interviews with them. And what I found consistently was that almost all of them had a deep sense of pride and confidence and didn't explicitly speak about feeling marginalized when asked. But in talking to them about their positive and negative experiences or how involved they were, some of them were institutionally involved, but most were not. And what I found in their stories was that they had a perpetual stranger experience. Perpetual stranger is a phrase, an adapted phrase that I took from the scholar Ronald Takaki, who spoke about how Latinos and Latinx people and Asian Americans in America are often perpetual foreigners. And I found through these interviews that Jews of color continually experience, and you'll see on this chart here, experiences in terms of Jewish visibility is the axis, is the vertical axis, and the horizontal axis is around acceptance within our Jewish community. And what we want to get is that to a point where Jews of color are just as visible and engaged as everyone else, but often they're either ignored or consistently confused as hired help, are asked to leave or treated as a threat, or are assumed to be a friend. And at best, at times, are treated like a token, which is better than being rejected, but still not where we want to get. We want to get where we're treating everyone, seeing everyone's uniqueness, but also treating them as everyone else. Next slide, please. So to conclude, begin to wrap up here in terms of my presentation, a few different pieces that I wanted to share. One is first to say that there is a tremendous amount of resource, both within our community, as you've already heard on this call, as well as throughout a number of different resources in terms of organizations, both secular and Jewish, that can help you in terms of navigating these questions. Certainly the three of us, and certainly I'm happy to be a resource, as I'm guessing my other co-panelists are as well. This is a long-term suggestion, but I would invite you to begin to try to widen your circle explicitly within the Jewish community. We're a diverse global Jewish people, and beginning to notice any group that you're in, ideally, if we're doing our work well, at least 1/10 of that group would be people of color. Seek out the voices and leadership of Jews of color, but avoid tokenism. And very briefly, without getting into too much depth, one of the best ways to do that is to strive for deeper relationships that are less transactional and more transformational. So less about simply hopping in for a meeting, but scheduling a time for lunch. Who are you inviting into your home or into your houses of worship and engaging? And as you think about taking on initiatives that include people of color, to think about including them at the beginning of the process rather than an invitation at the end, to bring in their thinking in the process along the way. Next slide. Thank you very much, Mirav. So in terms of some next steps or resources that are available that we offer here at the Union for Reform Judaism, in addition to Audacious Hospitality, we have a Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, which is a part of the URJ. And for more than 50 years, the Religious Action Center has been one of the hubs, primary hubs, of Jewish social justice and legislative activity in Washington, D.C. We work on many different issues, 70 different issues to be precise, and right now we're focusing in two areas that are relevant on this call. One right now is the Urgency of Now, our Urgency of Now campaign, and next slide please, is our racial justice campaign that is called Reflect, Relate, Reform. Audacious Hospitality has its own resources around racial and ethnic inclusion, which are included on the website here. I've included clippings from the website. You can get information about RAC reads, books, videos, discussion guides to begin to engage in this conversation, as well as resources for communities and congregations about actions to take to better engage Jews of color and work on racial and ethnic diversity within our community. Next slide. Another quick example in terms of working across lines of class and difference is our Nitzavim campaign, which is an ongoing campaign. It's not, we engaged in it for this recent election, and we'll continue the work moving forward of working to fight voter suppression and ensure that everyone has the right to vote. At the URJ, just like the JCPA, we are a strictly nonpartisan organization, and our goal is to actively engage all of our membership in this civic conversation and have an equal entry point to it, and be able to have their voice heard and their votes counted. With that, I just wanted to share two final thoughts that I was inspired to share in light of some of what came up on the call, and I really look forward to hearing people's thoughts and questions, as I wanted to speak to an element around white supremacy. As David noted, there is a lot of new language that's coming into the Jewish mainstream. I stand at the intersection. We're also navigating intersectionality and a lot of complexity. So I stand in this conversation as a vice president, as an executive leader of a large Jewish institution, and I'm also a member of the Movement for Black Lives. So to add on to what was already said too, we need to relax our litmus tests in part because we need to broaden how we collectively see ourselves as Jews. And that if there are people of color in our community, we have people who have multiple allegiances and are a source of strength for us in maintaining our values, but with greater nuance and with more access points and entry points to deeper and more powerful relationships. And often we're made to make a false choice between fighting against anti-Semitism, which is incredibly important, and working to end racism. But I think it's really critical to note that those two scourges in our society and trends are both two manifestations of white supremacy, and that through fighting both of those and working across lines of difference and similarity or intersection, that's how we're going to, I believe, best protect ourselves, is through our relationships as a predominantly white but also multi-ethnic, multiracial Jewish community. Next slide. So thank you very much.
Thank you, April. I'm sure we all learned. I learned a lot about what URJ and the RAC do in these issues. I want to open up the floor. We have some time for questions. So if anybody wants to ask anything specific about any of these topics, to learn more about what the broader issue area is, I know that Jennifer, David, and April would be very happy to answer any of those.
Hi, this is Jonathan Horowitz. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm curious, David, you touched on this a bit in your point about how language like racial justice may be still challenging for some people, and that language like racial equality resonates more with certain audiences. I'm curious actually for all three folks, what is the work that you need to do, or that you recommend that we all need to be doing to sort of widen the tent or make sure that we're getting outside of speaking just to the choir of, let's say, progressive elements of the Jewish community for whom the mission and the work you're describing resonates, and make sure this can be sort of heard more universally and understood more universally?
Is it okay if I start?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, great. So two things that come to mind immediately. Right now, the St. Louis Jewish Community Relations Council, which really, of all the Jewish organizations I can think of, has been at the front lines of the new civil rights frontier, is working with the Baltimore JCRC, which you can imagine has also been engaged, and potentially one or two others, to put on this summer a Jewish conversation on race. And the idea is to bring together about 100 or so leaders from around the country to have this conversation, to start building that language up and familiarizing ourselves with the various challenges and the various opportunities in this work. So this would be a great starting point for that, entering that discourse in a more robust way. And by the way, I will say that they are looking for funding for that, and it's a great opportunity for somebody to help make sure that happens. They've gotten some, but they still have a ways to go in making sure it happens this summer. Secondly, I think that a lot of this work has to happen locally. We find that, the more we can see local communities to engage in a serious way and to provide all the training that they need, the resources that they need, fly them to Washington or wherever with others that are doing this work. So if you did this in 4 or 5 communities, you bring all communities together, and then to compare notes and to study best practices and what have you. that's when you'll start to see traction. We need more living examples of great work being done in this way. We have a few, but there needs to be more, and I feel like a lot of this work has to be seeded locally before we can scale it at the national level, and before we can really equip ourselves and make the culture change that needs to happen in the Jewish community so that we can engage this work thoughtfully.
I can add something. This is Jennifer. I think for us, we've had a couple incidences either close to home with our own SEDEC Fellows program that we manage, but also with some of our grantees who've encountered some interesting anti-Semitic statements. And I think that in doing their work, and I think for us it's a matter of kind of decentering in a way, sort of the dominant paradigms that we're used to of whiteness. But frankly, and this isn't to knock, Christianity in any way, but it is a dominant paradigm in this country. So it really sort of, in a way, there's a lot of teaching moments, I think, when you're doing collaborative work, partnering, because you are talking to people who maybe don't always realize, that Judaism, Jews are to be considered in this work. That a lot of things sometimes center on Christianity, but then also not everything is whiteness too. So to consider that we can change that dominant paradigm, or at least try to. And I think it takes little steps. You were talking about close to home, David, but I think that's really true. There's just a lot of teaching moments, and not to be afraid, because people make mistakes. But I think if you kind of open your heart and kind of embrace the fear that comes with making a mistake or maybe stepping on toes, if we can just be respectful and try and learn from each other and move forward, I think that that's all we have. I know locally the Jewish Relations Council in our little town in Asheville here, they're going to be restarting that, and I think they just had a big community meeting among the Jewish community, and the framing of it really was about how do we stand up to discriminatory activities that also include anti-Semitism. So kind of a broader framework, and sort of including anti-Semitism, but really, recognizing that there are racial incidences that happen that are very unjust, and how do we respond to that in the Jewish community and in the wider community, and what is the Jewish response? So I don't know if that helped, but.
Yeah, and that was similar to what I was going to say too, is that at times it's helpful to start broad, because no matter where people stand on this issue right now, because of the strife that's been happening in terms of race in this country, and with the rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic hate crimes in the past several months, there's a need collectively for our community to talk about this in a way that there's a broader entry point for this conversation, and then to be equipped with resources that can help facilitate that conversation. On the Religious Action Center's Reflect, Relate, Reform website, we have a lot of resources, but we are not alone in that too. As Jennifer noted earlier, whether it's Bend the Arc or Jews for Racial and Economic Justice or JCPA, there are a lot of different resources that are out and available that can help people who are interested in looking and seeing a list of different books, whether it's Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson or Waking Up White, a variety of different books that can be entry points to a broader conversation in terms of a book study group, or more broadly having a broader frame of here's what's happening and how is that affecting us as Jews, and grounding it in some guiding principles, some of which Jennifer shared, and others that can be helpful in terms of centering the conversation on personal experience and not getting lost in the theoretical or language or specific policy debates, but rather what is this issue and how has how have these trends affected my family historically, and how is that affecting me and my thinking in this moment is a good starting point for more balanced level conversation.
Thank you all for those answers. Do we have any other questions? We have a little bit more time still. Okay. Okay, let's close for today. Thank you to our terrific speakers. You were each invaluable in your contributions today. We're so glad that you were able to find time in your very busy schedules. To our listeners, thank you all so much, funders and JFN members, for being on this call. If you have additional questions about this, I can put you in touch with all the folks who spoke today. We'll be sending around a brief survey to let us know how we're doing, how this was for you, and also the recording of this event. So we look forward to hearing from you on the survey and for you to send around the recording, and hope that this is of help and we can continue in this work together. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.